The snow fell in thick, heavy flakes, blanketing the empty road ahead as Emma and Jack drove in silence. The rhythmic hum of the tires rolling over the icy pavement was the only sound breaking through the quiet of the evening. The temperature had dropped drastically, and the heater inside the car was working overtime to keep the chill at bay. Jack kept his hands firmly on the wheel, his eyes scanning the dimly lit road, while Emma stared out the window, lost in thought. They had spent the entire day working, and now, all they wanted was to get home before the weather worsened. The headlights cut through the swirling snow, casting long shadows on the trees lining the road. It was a desolate stretch, the kind of place where the world seemed to shrink down to just the two of them and the road ahead. Emma wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders, rubbing her hands together for warmth. Despite the comfort of the car, there was something eerie about the night, something unsettling that she couldn't quite place. And then she saw it. A shadow among the trees, barely visible through the curtain of falling snow. At first, she thought it was just a trick of the light, a branch swaying in the wind or an illusion caused by the movement of the car. But as they got closer, she realized it was something else, something living. Her breath caught in her throat as she leaned forward, pressing her hand against the cold glass. "Jack, slow down," she said suddenly, her voice urgent. Jack glanced at her before following her gaze. "What is it?" "I saw something," Emma replied, her heart pounding now. "Something in the trees. I think it was an animal." Jack frowned but eased his foot off the gas, slowing the car to a crawl. "Probably a deer," he muttered, though there was uncertainty in his voice. Emma shook her head. "No, it wasn't a deer. It was smaller, but not small. I think it was a dog." Jack exhaled, reluctant to stop in the middle of nowhere during a snowstorm. "Emma, it's freezing out there. If it's a stray, there's not much we can do." But Emma wasn't listening anymore. She was already reaching for the door handle, her instincts screaming at her not to ignore what she had seen. As soon as the car came to a stop, she threw the door open, the biting wind slapping against her face as she stepped out into the snow. "Emma," Jack called after her, but she was already moving. The cold was brutal, slicing through her coat as she trudged toward the trees. Her boots crunched against the ice, her breath coming in short puffs of mist. The closer she got, the more her heart clenched. It wasn't just a dog wandering in the snow, it was something much worse. Tied to a tree, half buried in the snow, was a German shepherd. Emma gasped, the sight sending a shock wave through her chest. The dog wasn't moving, its body nearly motionless beneath the thick layer of snow that covered it. Only its faint breathing, visible in the frigid air, told her that it was still alive. "Oh my God," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. Jack was beside her now, his expression shifting from frustration to concern as he took in the scene. "Jesus," he muttered, "who the hell would do this?" The dog's fur was matted with ice, its eyes barely open. It looked exhausted, beaten down by the cold and whatever cruel circumstances had led it here. The rope around its neck was tied tight, cutting into its skin. Emma's hands shook as she reached for it. untying the frozen knots with numb fingers. "Hey, buddy," she murmured softly, her voice cracking. "It's okay, we've got you." The dog flinched at first, its body instinctively recoiling from her touch. But it was too weak to fight, too drained to resist. Emma's heart ached as she worked quickly, finally loosening the rope and freeing it from the tree. Jack knelt beside her, his hands hovering as if unsure of what to do. "We can't leave him here," he said, his voice firm now. "He won't last another hour in this cold." Emma nodded, blinking away the sting of tears. "We need to get him in the car. He needs warmth." Together, they carefully lifted the dog. It was lighter than it should have been, too thin, its ribs pressing against its skin. As they carried him back to the car, Emma felt a deep anger rising in her chest. Someone had left this dog to die. Someone had made the conscious decision to abandon him in the middle of a snowstorm. Tied up and helpless. As soon as they got back to the car, Jack opened the back seat, and they carefully placed the dog inside. Emma quickly shrugged off her coat and wrapped it around him, trying to provide whatever warmth she could. The dog let out a soft, pitiful whimper. Emma reached out, gently stroking his head. "You're safe now," she whispered. "We've got you." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair before shutting the door and getting back into the driver's seat. "We'll take him home," he said, his voice resigned but determined. "Figure out what to do from there." Emma nodded, her hands still on the dog. She could feel its shallow breaths against her palm, could sense the fragility of his state. "We'll take care of him," she said, more to herself than to Jack. As they pulled back onto the road, Emma kept her eyes on the dog, watching the way his body trembled slightly but no longer shivered violently. He was exhausted, barely holding on, but he was alive, and that was what mattered. Jack drove in silence, but Emma could see the tension in his jaw, the way his hands gripped the wheel just a little tighter. He was as upset as she was. Neither of them had expected this tonight. But now that it had happened, they both knew they couldn't turn their backs. The snow continued to fall, the wind howling outside, but inside the car, there was warmth, a second chance. As they neared home, Emma kept her hand on the dog, whispering reassurances, knowing deep down that tonight was only the beginning. The moment Emma and Jack realized what they were seeing, their bodies moved before their minds could fully catch up. Without hesitation, they rushed out of the car, the icy wind hitting them like a wall as they ran toward the motionless figure in the snow. Emma's boots crunched against the frozen ground, her breath coming in sharp, visible bursts as she pushed forward. Jack was right behind her, his face tense with urgency. The German Shepherd was barely conscious, its body curled in on itself as though trying to conserve the last remnants of warmth. Its fur was thickly coated in snow, and the way it barely moved sent a deep sense of dread through Emma's chest. She dropped to her knees beside the dog, reaching out carefully, her hands trembling not just from the cold but from the sheer desperation of the moment. "Hey, buddy," she whispered, her voice catching in her throat. "We're here. You're okay now." The dog didn't react at first. Emma's heart clenched at the sight of the thin, ragged frame, the ribs pressing through its coat. Its breathing was shallow, barely noticeable, and the way it lay there, defeated, abandoned, made Emma's stomach twist. Jack knelt beside her, his jaw set tight as he took in the horrible sight. Then, they saw the rope. It was thick, coarse, and wound cruelly tight around the dog's neck, tying it firmly to the base of a tree. The strands of the rope were completely frozen, stiff with ice, as if it had been there for hours, maybe longer. Emma reached for it with numb fingers, trying to loosen the knot, but the fibers were rock hard, frozen together as solidly as steel. "It's too tight," she murmured, panic creeping into her voice. "And it's frozen solid." Jack ran a gloved hand over the rope, testing it. His expression darkened. "It's like trying to untie a block of ice." He pulled at the knot, but it didn't budge. The rope had been wet when it was tied, and in the freezing temperatures, it had hardened into something nearly impossible to manipulate. Emma turned back to the dog. She gently touched its side, feeling the faintest rise and fall of its chest. It was alive, but barely. Every second wasted was another second closer to losing it. "We need to get it loose," she said urgently. "Now." Jack yanked at the rope with all his strength, his gloved hands slipping against the frozen strands. He cursed under his breath, his breath coming fast in the cold air. Emma tried too, her fingers raw and red from exposure. But nothing worked. The rope refused to give. Panic surged through her veins. They couldn't just sit here and struggle while the dog slipped further away. She frantically searched her pockets, hoping for something, anything, that could help. Then, her fingers brushed against the cold metal of her car keys. An idea struck. "I can cut it," she said suddenly, pulling the key from her pocket. Jack looked at her, confused. With a key? Emma didn't answer. She just turned back to the rope, gripping her key tightly. The edge wasn't sharp, but it was metal, sturdy enough to saw through the frozen fibers if she applied enough pressure. She pressed the edge of the key against the rope and began to work, dragging it back and forth with as much force as she could manage. The ice made it nearly impossible at first, the strands resisting with an unforgiving stiffness. Her hands ached from the cold, her fingers clumsy and slow, but she refused to stop. Jack, realizing what she was doing, steadied the rope for her. "Keep going," he urged. "You're making progress." Emma gritted her teeth and pushed harder. The key scraped against the frozen fibers, little by little wearing them down. It felt like an eternity, but she could see the rope starting to fray, tiny fibers splitting apart under the pressure. The dog stirred faintly beneath her hands. A small, weak movement. It was still alive, still holding on. That was all she needed to keep going. Her arms burned from the effort. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. Then, with one final pull, the rope snapped. Emma almost fell back from the force of it, gasping as the tension finally released. The severed strands fell away. And for the first time, the dog was free. Jack was already moving, carefully sliding his arms under the dog's frail body. "We need to get him into the car. Now." Emma nodded, shoving the broken rope aside. She placed a reassuring hand on the dog's head. whispering soothing words. "You're okay. We've got you." The dog barely reacted, but its eyes flickered slightly. Just a tiny movement. A faint glimmer of awareness. Jack lifted him carefully, cradling the limp body against his chest as he hurried back toward the car. Emma ran ahead, throwing open the back door, and Jack gently placed the dog onto the seat. Emma immediately pulled off her coat and wrapped it around him, trying to trap whatever warmth she could. Jack shut the door and turned to Emma. "We have to get home fast. He's not going to last much longer out here." Emma didn't need to be told twice. She climbed into the passenger seat, twisting around to check on the dog as Jack started the car. The heat was blasting, but it would take time for the warmth to reach the back. Emma unwrapped her scarf and tucked it around the dog as well, trying to keep him warm. "Come on, buddy," she whispered. "Stay with us." Jack drove as fast as he safely could, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The tension in the car was thick, neither of them speaking as they focused entirely on the fragile life in the backseat. Every now and then, Emma would reach back and place a hand on the dog's side, making sure he was still breathing. When they finally pulled into the driveway, Jack barely put the car in park before jumping out and rushing to open the back door. Emma was already there, carefully lifting the dog into her arms. He was so light, too light for a dog his size. "Inside," Jack said urgently, holding the door open for her. Emma carried the dog straight to the living room, gently laying him down on a pile of blankets they had set up. She knelt beside him, stroking his cold fur, willing him to stay with them. Jack returned moments later with a warm towel and a bowl of water. "Let's get him warm," he said. They worked quickly, drying off the melting snow from his fur, speaking softly to him all the while. The dog remained still but didn't resist their touch. His eyes fluttered open briefly, a weak but undeniable sign of life. Emma felt something tighten in her chest. He had made it. For now. She exchanged a glance with Jack, who let out a slow breath. "We did everything we could," he said quietly. Emma nodded, brushing a gentle hand over the dog's head. "And now we help him heal." The snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in cold silence. But inside, there was warmth. Inside, there was hope. Emma's hands trembled as she finally pried the last frozen strand of rope away from the tree. Her fingers were numb, burning from the cold, but she barely noticed. The only thing that mattered was the German shepherd lying in the snow, barely clinging to life. The moment the restraint was gone, she expected him to react, to try and move. But he didn't. He was too weak, his body limp and unresponsive except for the faintest rise and fall of his chest. Jack knelt beside her, his breath visible in the freezing air. "He's not going to make it out here," he said, his voice low but urgent. "We have to get him warm. Now." Emma nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. She gently slid her arms beneath the dog, expecting some resistance. But he didn't flinch, didn't struggle. It was as if he had already accepted his fate. That thought made her heart ache even more. As she lifted him, she was shocked by how light he was. He should have been heavy. German shepherds were strong. solid dogs, but this one felt fragile in her arms. His ribs pressing sharply against his thin coat. He had been starving, left out here in the cold, abandoned, with no chance of survival. The cruelty of it made her stomach turn. But there was no time for anger now. Jack was already moving, clearing the way back to the car. The snow had picked up again, falling in thick, swirling flakes around them. Emma held the dog close to her chest, shielding him from the wind as best she could. His fur was damp, clinging to her coat, and his body was ice cold against her skin. Every few seconds, she felt his shallow breath against her arm, a reminder that he was still with them, still fighting. They reached the car, and Jack yanked the door open. "Put him in the backseat," he said quickly. Emma climbed in, carefully settling the dog onto the blanket they had laid out earlier. He didn't move, didn't react, just lay there, his body rising and falling in slow, labored breaths. She pulled off her coat and draped it over him, tucking it around his frail body in an attempt to keep him warm. Jack jumped into the driver's seat, turning the key in the ignition. The car roared to life, the heater blasting on full power, though it would take time for the warmth to spread. He pulled out onto the road, his hands tight on the wheel, his jaw set in determination. "Where's the nearest vet?" he asked, his voice tense. Emma fumbled for her phone with shaking fingers, pulling up a search for emergency veterinary clinics. Her heart sank as she realized the closest one was nearly 30 minutes away. She turned the screen toward Jack. "This one's open 24 hours. But it's not close." Jack nodded grimly. "We don't have a choice." The tires spun for a second before gripping the icy road. And then they were off, the car speeding through the snow-covered streets. The world outside was a blur of white and dark shadows, streetlights glowing dimly through the storm. Inside the car, the air was thick with tension, the sound of the dog's weak breathing filling the space between them. Emma twisted in her seat to check on him. He hadn't moved. His eyes were half closed, unfocused, and his body shivered under the layers of fabric. Panic flared in her chest. Was he slipping away? She reached out, placing a gentle hand on his side. "Stay with us, buddy," she whispered. "We're almost there." Jack's hands gripped the wheel tighter. "He's gonna make it," he said, almost as if trying to convince himself as much as her. "He has to." The drive felt endless. Every red light, every slow-moving car ahead of them, made the seconds drag unbearably. Emma stole glances at the dashboard clock, watching the minutes tick away like a countdown. The snow was relentless, thickening by the second. Jack had to keep both hands on the wheel, his eyes darting between the road and the rearview mirror. The last thing they needed was to skid on ice and waste even more time. Emma kept her focus on the dog. She stroked his head, whispering reassurances, hoping he could hear her. "You're safe now," she murmured. "We're taking you somewhere warm. Just hold on." For a moment, she thought she saw the faintest flicker of recognition in his eyes. But it was gone just as quickly. Jack's voice broke through the silence. "Almost there. 5 more minutes." Emma nodded, swallowing down the fear threatening to consume her. 5 minutes felt like an eternity. She knew that the difference between life and death for this dog could be measured in seconds. Finally, the bright red glow of a veterinary hospital sign appeared in the distance. Jack barely slowed as he pulled into the parking lot, coming to a stop right in front of the entrance. Before he could even put the car in park, Emma was already moving. She threw open the door, scooping the dog into her arms once more. His body was still too cold, too still, but his shallow breaths told her he was still hanging on. Jack ran ahead, pushing through the glass doors. "We need help," he called out, his voice urgent. "Emergency." A vet technician immediately rushed forward, taking one look at the dog in Emma's arms before waving him inside. "Bring him in," she said quickly, leading them toward the examination room. Emma laid him down carefully on the padded table, stepping back as the team of veterinarians and assistants sprang into action. One of them pressed a stethoscope against his chest. Another wrapped him in warming blankets, while someone else prepared an IV. "What happened?" one of the vets asked as they worked. Jack ran a hand through his hair, still catching his breath. "We found him tied to a tree in the middle of nowhere. He was half buried in the snow. I don't know how long he'd been out there, but the rope was frozen solid." The vet's expression darkened, but she didn't say anything. Instead, she focused on the dog, her hands moving quickly and efficiently. "His body temperature is dangerously low. He's severely malnourished and dehydrated. But he's alive." Emma felt her knees weaken at those words. Alive. She exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Jack's hand found hers, giving it a squeeze. One of the vet assistants turned to them. "We'll do everything we can, but the next few hours will be critical." Emma nodded, her heart still racing. She knew they had done all they could. Now, it was up to him to fight. Jack pulled her into a side embrace, his warmth grounding her. "No matter what happens," he said softly, "at least he had a chance." Emma looked at the frail dog, now wrapped in warmth, surrounded by people who cared. And for the first time since they found him, she allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he would make it. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled the air as Emma and Jack sat in the waiting room of the veterinary clinic, their hands wrapped around cups of lukewarm coffee the receptionist had given them. The adrenaline from the rescue had begun to wear off, replaced by a deep, exhausted worry. The snowstorm still raged outside, wind rattling against the windows. But inside, everything was still. The only sound was the occasional beep from medical monitors in the back rooms. Jack rubbed his hands together, trying to warm them. "He's strong," he said, mostly to reassure himself. "He made it this far. He's going to pull through." Emma nodded, but her throat was too tight to speak. She had barely taken her eyes off the hallway where the vet had taken the German Shepherd for treatment. Every minute felt stretched, every second carrying the weight of uncertainty. They had done everything they could, freed him, gotten him here in time, but the rest was out of their hands. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely no more than 20 minutes, Dr. Wallace, the veterinarian, emerged from the hallway. She was in her late 50s. her face lined with experience and empathy. She carried a clipboard and approached them with a calm but serious expression. Emma stood up immediately, Jack right behind her. "How is he?" she asked, voice tight with concern. Dr. Wallace offered a small smile. "He's stable, hypothermic, dehydrated, and severely malnourished, but he's responding well to fluids and warmth. It's going to take time. But he's a fighter." Emma let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Jack squeezed her shoulder, a silent acknowledgement of the relief they both felt. "There's something else," Dr. Wallace continued, glancing at her clipboard. "We scanned for a microchip." Emma's heart skipped. "He has one?" Dr. Wallace nodded. "Yes. He's registered to someone right here in town." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Emma had been hoping, perhaps foolishly, that the dog had been abandoned by someone passing through. Someone they'd never be able to track down. But this meant someone in their own community had done this. Had tied that dog to a tree and left him to die in the snow. Jack's face darkened. "Who is it?" Dr. Wallace hesitated. "I have a name and phone number," she said, handing him a small printout. "Legally, I'm required to contact the owner. But given the condition you found him in, I wanted to let you know first." Emma took the paper, her hands shaking slightly as she read the name. Richard Carlson. The name didn't ring a bell. But the address was local. Someone in their own town had looked at that dog. The same dog now fighting for his life in the back room, and decided he wasn't worth keeping. That he could be discarded like trash. Jack let out a slow breath, clearly struggling to keep his anger in check. "Are you going to call him?" he asked, though they all knew the answer. Dr. Wallace nodded. "I have too. But I think you should hear the conversation." Emma and Jack followed the vet to her office, where she sat at her desk and dialed the number. The phone rang twice before a deep, gruff voice answered. "Yeah?" Dr. Wallace kept her voice even. "Professional. Mr. Carlson. This is Dr. Wallace from Westfield Veterinary Clinic. We have your German Shepherd here." There was a long pause. Then, the man scoffed. "You found that damn thing? Figures." Emma's stomach twisted. Dr. Wallace didn't react. "Sir, your dog was discovered tied to a tree in the middle of a snowstorm. Severely underweight and suffering from hypothermia. We need to discuss." "I don't need to discuss anything," Carlson interrupted, his voice cold, dismissive. "That mutt's not my problem anymore." Emma's nails dug into her palms. Jack tensed beside her, his jaw tightening. Dr. Wallace's eyes narrowed slightly. "So you abandoned him?" Carlson didn't even hesitate. "Yeah, I left him out there. What's the big deal? He's old, useless, wasn't worth feeding anymore." Emma felt like she was going to be sick. She clenched her fists, willing herself not to scream into the phone. Dr. Wallace, to her credit, kept her voice measured. "You're aware that abandoning an animal is illegal, Mr. Carlson?" The man actually chuckled. "Lady, I don't care. Do whatever you want with him. Put him down for all I care. Ain't my problem." Emma couldn't hold back anymore. "You heartless bastard!" she burst out, her voice shaking with rage. "You left him to die." There was silence on the other end. Then, Another cruel laugh. Well, guess someone's real worked up about a stupid dog. Jack stepped in before Emma could say something worse. He deserves better than you, he said, voice low and angry. You're a miserable excuse for a human being. Carlson snorted. Yeah, you want him, keep him. I don't give a damn. The line went dead. Emma stood there, shaking, staring at the phone like it might come back to life and give her the chance to scream at him some more. Jack ran a hand down his face, exhaling sharply, trying to steady himself. Dr. Wallace set the phone down carefully. Well, she said after a moment. I suppose that settles it. Emma swallowed hard. That poor dog. She looked at the vet with pleading eyes. Can we keep him, officially? Dr. Wallace smiled softly. You two already saved his life once. I think it's safe to say he belongs with you. Relief, grief, and anger swirled in Emma's chest all at once. Jack put a steadying hand on her back, and she leaned into it, drawing strength from his presence. We'll take care of him, Jack said firmly. We'll give him the life that bastard never did. Dr. Wallace nodded. I'll get the paperwork started. As they left the office, Emma wiped at the tears burning her eyes. It wasn't just the cruelty of what had happened. It was knowing how close that poor dog had come to dying alone. Unwanted. But not anymore. He had a home now. A real home. One where he would be loved, cherished, protected. And no one, no cruel, heartless man, would ever hurt him again. Emma and Jack left the veterinary clinic that night with a new purpose, a new responsibility, and, most importantly, a new family member. The moment they heard Richard Carlson's callous words, there had been no question. Max was never going back to him. They wouldn't allow it. The man had given up his right to this dog the moment he tied him to a tree and walked away. Now, Max belonged to them, and they would make sure he never suffered again. It wasn't an immediate transformation. When Max was released into their care, he was still weak, his body thin and fragile from starvation. The veterinarians had done everything they could to stabilize him, but it was now up to Emma and Jack to help him heal. Not just physically, but emotionally. Their first night at home with Max was quiet. Jack had carried him inside, laying him gently on a soft bed of blankets they had arranged by the fireplace. The warmth of the crackling fire filled the room, melting away the last traces of cold that had clung to Max's body. But he didn't move much, only shifting slightly when Emma knelt beside him, offering a gentle stroke to his fur. "You're safe now," she whispered. "You don't have to be afraid anymore." Max's dark eyes flickered toward her, hesitant but searching. He didn't flinch, didn't pull away, but he also didn't lean into her touch. It would take time. Emma knew that. Trust wasn't built overnight, especially not for a dog who had only known betrayal. Jack sat down beside her, watching Max with quiet determination. "We should give him a name," he said. "Something that means a fresh start." Emma thought for a moment, looking at the dog who had been so close to death, who had fought against all odds. "Max," she finally said, "short for Maximilian. It means greatest, because he's going to have the greatest life from now on." Jack smiled. "Max it is. The days that followed were filled with careful nursing, patience, and quiet victories. At first, Max was too weak to do much on his own. He slept most of the time, only stirring to eat small portions of the meals Emma prepared for him, warm, soft food that wouldn't upset his fragile system. Jack had built a ramp at the back door so Max wouldn't have to struggle getting outside when he needed to. They never left him alone for too long, always keeping him within sight, reassuring him with their presence. Slowly, he began to improve. His coat, once dull and matted, grew shinier with regular brushing and baths. His ribs, which had jutted out beneath his skin, were no longer so visible as he gained weight. But more than the physical changes, it was the emotional ones that truly showed progress. At first, Max avoided direct eye contact, as if expecting something bad to happen whenever a hand reached toward him. But little by little, that changed. One evening, as Emma sat on the floor reading, she felt a gentle weight pressed against her leg. She looked down to find Max resting his head on her knee. Her heart swelled as she reached down, stroking between his ears. This time, he didn't just allow it, he leaned into her touch. Jack noticed, smiling as he watched. "Looks like somebody's finally realizing he's home." Emma ran her fingers through Max's fur, feeling the warmth of his body against her. "Yeah," she said softly, "I think he is." As weeks turned into months, Max continued to blossom. The fear in his eyes faded, replaced by something softer, something trusting. He no longer flinched when Jack reached out to pet him. He wagged his tail, hesitantly at first, then more freely as he learned that happiness was something he was allowed to feel. One of the biggest milestones came on a crisp spring morning. Jack had been outside working on repairs, and Emma stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes. She glanced out the window, expecting to see Max lying on the porch, as he often did, but instead, he was moving, trotting toward Jack, his tail high, ears alert. Then, as if testing his own courage, he took a step closer and nudged Jack's hand with his nose. Jack froze for a moment before dropping the hammer he was holding and crouching down. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, scratching behind Max's ears. "That's the first time you've come to me on your own." Emma watched, tears welling in her eyes. It was a small gesture, but it meant everything. Max had made his choice. He trusted them now. He was no longer just surviving, he was living. Over time, Max became inseparable from them. He followed Emma from room to room, curling up at her feet while she worked. He took afternoon naps by Jack's side, lying in the sun-drenched backyard. He went on walks with them, still cautious but no longer looking over his shoulder as if expecting something bad to happen. Every night, when Emma and Jack sat on the couch watching TV, Max would hop up beside them, resting his head on Jack's lap or draping his paws over Emma's legs. He was no longer the broken, terrified creature they had found in the snow. He was strong now, loved, home. One evening, as the fire crackled in the hearth, Jack looked over at Max, who was sprawled out on his back, completely at ease. "Hard to believe he's the same dog we found that night," he said. Emma reached down, scratching Max's belly as he let out a contented sigh. "Yeah," she agreed, "but he always had this in him. He just needed someone to believe in him." Jack nodded. "Good thing he found us." Emma smiled, resting her head against Jack's shoulder. "Or maybe we found each other." As the fire burned low and the evening settled into a peaceful quiet, Max let out a deep, happy sigh and curled up between them. He was no longer lost, no longer afraid. He was home.
Thank you for watching the video. If you enjoyed it, please comment 1. And if you didn't, just hit like. See you in the next videos.